So imagine you have just built a multi-million-dollar tech startup. I mean, right from the ground up.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Yeah. And the underlying code is, it's flawless. The
Yeah.
product is incredibly innovative, and your initial market fit is just perfect.
Right, the dream scenario.
Exactly. You are the sole founder, you hold the entire vision, and you understand exactly how the system needs to operate so you can scale it globally. But on day one of operation, you make this truly baffling decision.
Oh no, what do I do?
You hire 5 brand new interns, and instead of giving them, a standard list of tasks, you hand them absolute unoverridable veto power over the company's core strategy.
Wait, what?
Yeah, you give them the authority to rewrite the fundamental code of your product on the fly based entirely on whatever mood they happen to be in that morning.
I mean, you wouldn't do it. No rational person would ever do that.
Right. Because it's organizational suicide. You know intuitively that if you introduce 5 competing design laws into a single system, the output isn't innovation.
No, the output is catastrophic collapse.
Exactly. Yet, according to the really fascinating material we're diving into today, this exact fatal flaw, this structural suicide, is precisely how human beings have designed almost every civilization in recorded history.
It's the ultimate paradox of human sociology, honestly, because we demand structural clarity in our microsystems, right?
Yeah.
Like our businesses, our local councils, airplanes.
You definitely want a unified command structure on an airplane.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But when it comes to the macro system, like our entire civilization, we inexplicably tolerate and even celebrate an organizational chart that looks like a bowl of spaghetti.
Yeah.
We intentionally design systems that are entirely fractured right at the foundational level.
Which brings us to the core mission of today's Deep Dive. Because today, we are going to look at this phenomenon through a very specific, and I think a highly unexpected lens for a lot of you listening.
Yeah, definitely unexpected.
We are unpacking a transcript of a lecture. It was delivered on September 14th, 1979 by the scholar Ghulam Ahmed Parvez. And he's doing this deep dive analysis of an ancient text.
Yeah.
Specifically verses 28 through 32 of Surah Ar-Rum from the Quran.
But, and I need to stress this right up front before anyone assumes they know exactly where this is going, we have to establish some really rigid ground rules for this discussion.
Yes, essential ground rules.
If you tuned in today expecting like a religious sermon, you are in the wrong place. We are taking this text and we are methodically stripping away all the traditional religious sentimentality.
All the mysticism, the dogma.
Exactly. We aren't here to debate theology, and we are absolutely not endorsing any specific religious or political stance, not left-wing, not right-wing, nothing in between.
Right. Our approach today is strictly 100% analytical. We're looking at this source material purely to understand the structural ideas it presents.
Because what Parvez argues in this 1979 lecture is, frankly, revolutionary. He claims that if you look past the centuries of traditional ritualistic interpretation, these specific verses aren't actually about mystical theology at all.
No, they're not.
He argues they constitute a masterclass in sociology, in cybernetics, and systems engineering. He treats this text as a foundational blueprint for civilizational survival and organizational architecture.
Which is wild to think about.
Yeah.
He essentially posits that the text is offering an objective theorem, right?
Yes.
It's a diagnosis of how systems, whether that's a global economy, a national government, or, a tribal society, how they either sustain their equilibrium or inevitably just tear themselves apart.
Precisely.
So the obvious question for you, the listener, becomes, how do we bridge that gap? How do we get from an ancient scripture to discussing the cybernetics of a modern society?
Right, it's a big leap.
It is. But according to the source, we have to start by completely exploding a massive historical myth about what the concept of polytheism actually means. And the text does this by utilizing what we can call the partner test.
The partner test. This is where we look at verse 28 of the text. Because Parvez completely reframes the traditional understanding of the Arabic word shirk.
Okay, let's break that down.
So historically, and in almost every conventional translation you'll find, shirk is translated simply as associating partners with God, or just, polytheism.
And when a modern listener hears the word polytheism, the mental image is immediate, right?
Oh, yeah. You picture ancient Greece or ancient Mesopotamia.
Exactly. Marble temples, people bowing down to a statue of a rain god or, a sun god. We categorize it purely as primitive idolatry.
We think of it as a theological crime, essentially. We assume the text is saying, the ultimate creator is jealous that you're paying attention to this piece of carved stone.
Right, like a cosmic jealousy.
That is the conventional read. But Parwes argues that viewing this concept merely as bowing to stone idols misses the entire sociological and structural weight of the text.
Which is huge.
He argues that this verse is actually delivering a devastating critique of structural incoherence. It is not a story about theological jealousy. It is an exploration of an organizational failure mode.
Okay, let's look at the actual analogy the verse uses to make this point, because it's incredibly grounded.
It really is.
The text asks the reader a direct, highly uncomfortable question based on the socio-economic realities of its time. It asks, would you take your own subordinates, and the historical context here uses slaves or servants, and make them absolute equal partners in the wealth and the enterprise you've built?
To the point where you actually fear them and defer to them the way you would fear your own peers?
Right. It forces the reader into this thought experiment about authority and coherence. If you're the ultimate architect of a system, you have established a unified design law. You know how the inputs and outputs are supposed to balance.
Exactly. And if you suddenly elevate subordinates entities that definitely do not possess the comprehensive knowledge of the entire system, if you elevate them to the level of ultimate decision makers, you shatter the integrity of your own design.
This goes right back to the startup analogy we started with.
Yes, the interns.
If I build the company, I wouldn't let my marketing department completely override the core engineering of the product because they don't understand the physics of the code.
No, of course not.
I wouldn't give the new intern veto power over the financial strategy. So Parwes is basically asking, if you wouldn't accept that kind of fatal structural flaw in your own tiny, fragile human system, why would you project that exact kind of structural chaos onto the architecture of the entire universe?
The logic holds perfectly. I mean, if a firm operates where employees simultaneously answer to 4 different bosses and each boss has competing contradictory strategies, what happens?
The company fails.
Exactly. Productivity plummets, friction skyrockets, resources are drained by internal conflict, and the firm goes under. So the partners mentioned in the text, in the Quran's target here, they are not physical statues.
Right, because a statue can't issue a competing command. A piece of wood isn't going to email you a new corporate strategy.
Exactly. The partners are whatever competing authorities a society allows to override the central unified design law.
Okay, wow. That is a profound paradigm shift. We are moving from a superstitious framework to a highly functional cybernetic framework.
Yes.
So in this sociological lens, these partners, these competing bosses,
Yeah.
could be literally anything that issues a directive contrary to the system's core equilibrium.
They take 1,000 different forms throughout history. They could be rigid tribal customs that demand endless bloody retribution when the central design law actually demands objective justice.
Oh, interesting.
Or they could be unchecked economic monopolies that demand the exploitation of labor when the central law demands equitable distribution of resources.
Right.
They could be priestly decrees that invent arbitrary new restrictions out of thin air just to control a population. Whenever a human society allows these secondary competing power centers to issue commands that contradict the foundational operating system, they have committed shirk.
They've fractured the command structure.
They've committed an organizational failure.
So polytheism, as defined by this 1979 lecture, is literally just a fragmented organizational chart.
That's exactly what it is.
It's having too many cooks in the kitchen, but scaled up to a civilizational level. It's a state where the governing laws of a society are in constant contradiction with themselves.
Yes, because a divided command structure cannot produce a coherent output. I mean, it is a mathematical impossibility.
Right.
If the instructions from the top are contradictory, like if the economic system says hoard wealth, but the social system says care for the poor, the system experiences extreme internal friction, and it eventually tears itself apart from the inside.
Okay, I follow the logic. A unified command structure is objectively better than a fractured one. But this raises a massive historical question for me.
Okay, what is it?
If divided authority is the absolute root of systemic failure, if it's this obvious that having competing bosses destroys the societal company, how did human beings historically justify fracturing their command structures for thousands and thousands of years?
That's the million-dollar question.
I mean, why would anyone engineer a society like that on purpose, knowing it creates so much friction?
Well, because it benefits the people who hold the fractured pieces of power. And this leads us directly into Parwes's analysis of the architecture of power, specifically this incredibly insidious historical concept of delegated authority.
Right, the lecture dives really deep into this. Parwaz points out that human beings historically created this concept of delegated powers specifically as a psychological tool to justify their own absolute rule over others.
Yeah.
The idea was that the supreme authority God, the ultimate design law of the universe, had somehow handed over or delegated his legislative authority to a select group of human kings or priests.
And we see this replicated across completely different cultures and geographies over and over. Parwez cites the divine right of kings in Europe.
Right.
The monarch wasn't just presenting himself as like a capable political administrator. That wouldn't give him enough leverage to extract the taxes and obedience he wanted.
No, he needed an absolute mandate.
Exactly. He claimed to be exercising powers directly delegated by God. Therefore, whatever the king decided to do, whether it was crushing peasant uprisings, launching vanity wars, or imposing crushing taxation, it was framed not as a human policy choice, but as the unquestionable will of heaven.
And if you question the king, you're questioning the universe.
Right. The lecture also mentions the Eastern equivalent to this, the concept of Sultan Zulula, which translates to the king being the literal shadow of God on earth.
It is the exact same structural trick.
It really is.
If you are the shadow of the ultimate authority, anyone who disobeys you is disobeying the ultimate authority. It's a brilliant but terrifying hack of the human psychological operating system.
It is. But if we look at history, systems that rely on that hack eventually blow up. They always do. Parwez argues that secularism, as it emerged in Europe during the Enlightenment, wasn't born in a vacuum.
Right, it wasn't just philosophers having a chat.
No, it wasn't just a group of thinkers sitting in a salon deciding they didn't like religion anymore. It was a violent, extreme, and completely necessary systemic reaction to this extreme religious overreach.
Think about what the populace was experiencing at that time. The church and the crown had basically formed an unholy alliance. They were acting as a cartel.
A cartel of delegated authority.
Exactly. They claimed they were the deputy commissioners of God, exercising this delegated power. But the actual outputs of their system were poverty, endless religious wars, and just brutal oppression.
Parwez uses a brilliant quote here. He says, if you don't believe in the commissioner, why would you believe in the deputy commissioner?
Oh, that's so good. It perfectly captures the structural logic of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution.
Yeah.
The populace realized the entire system was corrupt. But they didn't just rebel against a specific king. They rebelled against the entire premise of the organizational chart.
Exactly. Secularism was a desperately needed rejection of this fraudulent delegated authority. The people essentially looked at the church and the crown and said, you claim to be the deputy commissioners representing the ultimate commissioner. Well, we are firing you. And since your authority is supposedly tied to him, we're firing him too.
Wow, so secularism was basically the societal immune system attacking a parasite that had disguised itself as the brain.
That is a perfect way to put it.
But, and that makes total historical sense, the pendulum swings to the absolute opposite extreme just to break the structural deadlock.
Oh.
But here is where the lecture gets incredibly relevant to the modern day.
Yes, the shape-shifting.
Right. Parwaz highlights that this concept of delegated authority didn't actually vanish when we got rid of absolute monarchies. It just mutated. Even today, right now, the 21st century, you have modern political factions or religious groups who claim they possess the exclusive right to implement divine law.
And Parwez fiercely opposed this in his writings, which, by the way, made him a highly controversial figure. He viewed these modern claims as structurally identical to the old shadow of God concept.
The exact same glitch.
Exactly. He argued that any human group claiming exclusive rights to divine legislation is inherently polytheistic in the systemic organizational sense we just defined.
Because they're setting themselves up as a partner.
Precisely, because it assumes a unified, perfect design law can be hijacked, owned, and interpreted exclusively by a single human faction, turning that faction into a partner with the ultimate authority.
Okay, I need to push back on this a little bit because we need to really pressure test this idea.
Okay, go for it.
If you are running a massive, complex society, I mean, we are talking millions of people, intricate global supply chains, international diplomacy, macroeconomic policy, doesn't a system absolutely require delegation to actually function?
Yeah.
I mean, a CEO cannot micromanage every single line of code written by the engineering team. A central federal government has to delegate power to local municipalities or state governments.
Yeah.
How is the concept of a human administrator polytheistic if it's practically necessary for survival?
That is the critical distinction, and it is exactly why Parwez does a very deep linguistic breakdown in this lecture of the Arabic word kadir, which is used in the source text to describe the supreme authority. The distinction lies entirely in what is being delegated.
Okay, break down the linguistics of Kadir for us.
So, in traditional translations, kadir is often rendered simply as powerful or capable, but Arabic is an incredibly mathematically precise language. The architecture of the words really matters. Kadir actually implies a continuous permanence.
Like an ongoing state.
Yes. It doesn't just mean powerful. It means permanently capable or possessing an enduring, uninterrupted capacity.
Okay, so it's a constant state of being, not just a temporary exertion of force.
Exactly. Now let's look at human systems. When a human CEO delegates power to a regional manager for that specific task, the CEO has temporarily surrendered their direct power.
Right.
The manager is now exercising it. The CEO is not permanently capable of being everywhere at once. But the supreme design law of the universe, the Qadir, does not delegate its legislative authority because it is permanently capable of maintaining the system.
Ah. So the critical distinction here is legislative authority versus administrative execution.
Precisely. You can, and honestly you must, have human administrators who ensure the system runs smoothly. You need judges, you need mayors, you need logistics managers.
Sure.
But the moment those administrators start inventing their own competing laws, their own arbitrary rules that contradict the core design parameters, that is when they stop being administrators and start claiming to be legislative partners.
Okay, going back to our tech startup analogy. It is totally fine and necessary for the CEO to let the marketing director run an ad campaign. That is administration.
Right.
It is not fine for the marketing director to suddenly decide, actually, we aren't a software company anymore, we are a fast food chain, and start buying deep fryers with the company treasury.
That is a perfect visualization of the failure mode. The supreme authority provides the unchangeable parameters, the physical laws of the universe, and the fundamental moral laws of societal equilibrium. Humans are meant to administrate within those parameters, applying them to the changing times, but never overwriting the core code.
So when human factions invent competing laws based on their own localized interests, they fragment the productive output of the entire society.
Yes, and they cause the system to collapse.
Okay. So if a fragmented system, one with competing bosses, rewritten code, and fractured laws, if that inevitably fails and tears itself apart, what does the alternative actually look like?
What is the ideal model?
Right. What does a perfectly engineered, self-sustaining human system look like? Well, the source text gives us a very specific terminology for it in verse 30.
Yes, the text introduces the concept of din al-qayyim, and it inextricably links it with another phrase, fitratullah.
And this is where the linguistic deep dive gets incredibly profound, because Parwez argues that for centuries, these two terms have been wildly, almost dangerously misunderstood by traditional commentators.
Completely misunderstood to the point of reversing their actual utility.
Yeah.
Let's start with fitratullah. For hundreds of years, this has been loosely and mystically translated as the nature of God. Now think about that from a systems engineering perspective. That translation leads you into an impossible philosophical trap.
Because what does the nature of an incomprehensible divine entity even mean?
Exactly. It's completely abstract. It offers no practical blueprint for a human society.
It sounds like something you meditate on a mountain, not something you use to build an economy.
Right. But Parwez goes back to the classical root of the word fitra. It does not mean a mystical abstract nature. It means God's law of creation.
The physical and structural blueprint.
Yes, the fundamental operating physics of the universe. It is the objective, observable reality of how things are built to function. It is the fact that water flows downhill, that carbon bonds in specific ways, and that human societies require justice to avoid revolt. That is the fitra.
That makes so much more sense. And then we have Din al-Qayyim. Parwez notes that the word din, which is often poorly translated simply as religion, actually implies a comprehensive system of life, a path or a channel.
And qayyim comes from the Arabic root word qama, which basically means to stand. But again, the nuance here changes everything.
Right, because he says the ancient Arabs didn't just use comma to mean standing up like, say, a wooden post stuck in the mud.
Because a wooden post is static. It can be easily knocked over by an external force. It has no internal mechanism to maintain its posture.
Exactly. He says comma means standing with perfect equilibrium, proportionality, and dynamic balance. It's not just upright. It is structurally sound. If the balance shifts even slightly, the entity fails.
The best analogy for Din al-Qayyim is actually a gyroscope.
Oh, I like that.
A gyroscope stands upright, but it doesn't do so by being static. It stands through continuous, dynamic, internal balance. It resists lateral forces because its internal operating system is perfectly aligned.
So Din al-Qayyim is a self-sustaining, self-correcting, structurally perfect societal system.
Yes, it is a system where the socioeconomic inputs and outputs are flawlessly balanced.
So we have the objective law of creation fitratola and the perfectly balanced human system that aligns with it, Din al-Qayyim. And Parwez draws this absolutely brilliant contrast in the lecture between the physical universe and human society.
Yeah, he points out that the rest of the physical universe follows this law completely, perfectly, and entirely involuntarily.
The examples he uses in the source are so grounded and undeniable. Like, a goat doesn't stand in a field, agonizing over an existential crisis, debating whether it should become a carnivore today.
No, it is programmed to eat grass. It follows its fitra.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A baby chick doesn't willfully walk into a roaring fire out of sheer rebellion. It instinctively avoids it. The entire physical universe operates on a flawless, unified command structure.
He even brings up the biology of embryonic development.
Oh yeah, this part was fascinating.
Right. Parwez points out that long before human beings invented the microscope, the Quran accurately described the sequential, strict evolutionary biological laws of how an embryo develops in the womb.
From a single fertilized cell to a complex organism with a beating heart.
And the process strictly follows the Din al-Qayyim, the perfectly balanced law of creation, without any deviation. The cells in a developing embryo don't form factions.
No.
They don't hold a debate over whether they should turn into a liver or a lung. They execute the unified design law.
But then we get to human beings. And humans, the lecture argues, represent a massive paradigm-shifting evolutionary leap. Why? Because human beings possess a variable that the goat and the embryo do not.
We have choice.
We have the capacity to conceive of two different possibilities and actually select between them.
And from a systems engineering perspective, choice is the most powerful, volatile, and dangerous variable you can possibly introduce into any closed system.
Because with choice comes raw, emotional energy. It brings ambition, desire, greed, empathy, innovation. And the source uses another incredible linguistic note here on the Arabic word awa.
Which is usually just flatly translated as emotions or vain desires.
Right. But Parwez explains that the ancient Arabs used the root of the word awa to describe something highly specific. They use it to describe a massive boulder that has been painstakingly carried to the very peak of a mountain.
This is perhaps the most striking visual and physical analogy in the entire lecture. It perfectly captures the physics of human sociology.
Just think about the physics of that image.
Yeah.
You have this massive stone sitting at the apex. It is holding an immense, almost incalculable amount of potential energy. As long as it is held there, it is stable. But what happens if you let it go without a track to guide it?
It destroys itself. It violently crashes down the mountain, unpredictably bouncing off ridges, smashing trees, and just obliterating whatever village happens to be in the valley below.
Yes. And Parwez is arguing that is what human emotion is. That is human ambition. Emotions, desires, the drive to build, the drive to acquire, they are not inherently evil.
Right, the text isn't telling you to become an emotionless robot.
Exactly. Emotions are raw kinetic energy. They're the boulder at the top of the mountain. But using that immense energy without the track of a unified design law, without the equilibrium of the Din al-Qayyim, is structural suicide.
Think about human history through this exact lens. We have this incredible kinetic energy, the ambition to build empires, the creativity to invent new technologies, the desire for security. But when we refuse to build a track for that energy, when we reject the objective law of equilibrium and instead let every individual king or corporation or tribe carve their own chaotic path down the mountain, what is the output?
Absolute chaos.
The output is the transatlantic slave trade. The output is 2 world wars. The output is massive environmental degradation.
The boulder just smashes through the village over and over again.
Exactly. The purpose of the track isn't to destroy the boulder's energy, it is to harness it. I mean, a river without banks isn't a river. It's a flood that destroys crops and drowns cities. But a river with strong, defined banks, a channel, a dene, generates hydroelectric power and sustains life.
Okay, so what happens when human beings use their evolutionary gift of choice to actively ignore the track? What happens when they look at the mountain and decide, you know what, I'm going to build my own separate track for my own boulder and you build yours?
Well, they fracture the system.
They fracture the system. And according to Parwez's analysis of verses 31 and 32, the consequences of that fracture are not random and they are not arbitrary. They are mathematical in their certainty.
This brings us to the core diagnosis of civilizational collapse. The text explicitly warns the reader against becoming like the mushrikeen, those who associate partners.
Right.
But again, how does the text itself define who these people are? It doesn't say those who carve statues out of wood.
No, it doesn't. Verse 32 defines them explicitly. It says the mushrikeen are those who divide their system and become factions. The Arabic word used is azab, parties, sects, factions.
This is where Parwez introduces a concept that is absolutely vital for the modern analytical listener to grasp, mukafat amal, which translates to the law of requital.
The law of requital.
The punishment for divided loyalty, the punishment for factionalism, is not lightning bolts hurled from the sky by an angry deity.
It is not a magical smiting from the clouds.
No, it is systemic degradation. It is the natural, inevitable consequence of breaking the laws of physics or sociology. If you step off the roof of a 10-story building, the law of gravity doesn't punish you because it is angry with you.
Gravity has no emotions.
Exactly. Gravity simply asserts itself. The consequence is built into the action. Similarly, if you fracture a society into competing factions, the law of requital asserts itself through the friction, degradation, and ultimate collapse of that society.
And Parwez unpacks verse 32 with this scalpel-like precision. The verse describes these factions, these azab, by saying, each party rejoicing in what it has.
That phrase,
rejoicing in what it has, is the ultimate sociological diagnosis of the disease of factionalism.
it is a perfect description of a phenomenon that systems engineers and economists deal with every single day. The fatal flaw of local optimization at the expense of systemic function.
Okay, I really want to push back on this
Yeah.
because we need to separate this ancient text from modern political theory.
Sure, let's test it.
In a modern democratic society or a free market economy, we are taught from day one that diversity of thought is a feature, not a bug. We want different political parties debating policy. We want different departments in a company aggressively advocating for their own budgets.
Right.
We want startups competing to destroy legacy monopolies. So why is rejoicing in what your faction has considered so mathematically dangerous here? Is Parwez arguing for a totalitarian state where we all have to be identical, thoughtless drones?
Not at all. And that is a crucial distinction. There is a profound difference between a diversity of skills contributing to a unified goal and a diversity of core objectives actively competing to destroy one another.
Okay, unpack that.
The text is not arguing against diverse skill sets. It is arguing against fractured operating laws.
Yeah.
Let's really dig into your corporate analogy because it illuminates the mechanics of this perfectly.
Let's pull it apart.
Imagine a massive multinational technology company. You have a marketing department, an R&D department, a customer support department. Diversity of skills is absolutely essential here.
Right. Marketing knows how to analyze consumer psychology. R&D knows how to write complex algorithms. Support knows how to de-escalate angry clients.
Exactly. As long as they are all operating under the Din al-Qayyim, the unified design law of the company, which is to create a functional product that solves a real problem and generates sustainable revenue, they thrive. They act as different organs in the same body.
They are diverse, but they are on the exact same track down the mountain.
Yes. But what happens if the company fractures into factions? What happens if the marketing department decides its ultimate goal is no longer the health of the company, but simply to maximize its own departmental budget and win industry awards?
Oh, I see where this is going.
Marketing might decide to launch a massive, incredibly expensive Super Bowl-level ad campaign for a product feature that R&D has repeatedly told them is physically impossible to build.
Wow.
Marketing rejoices in what it has. They get a massive budget increase, they throw lavish launch parties, they win advertising awards. They have successfully optimized their local faction.
Right. But to pay for that ad campaign, they diverted funds away from R&D. So the engineers can't finish the actual product ship's broken, the customers revolt, the stock plummets, and the entire company goes bankrupt.
Yeah.
The marketing department optimized locally, but they absolutely destroyed the systemic function.
Exactly. The local optimization of the faction killed the host organism. We can look at this through a biological lens as well.
Yeah.
The human body is a masterpiece of diverse systems. The heart, the lungs, the liver, the immune system, they are wildly diverse. They do completely different things. But they operate under a unified biological law. They share resources based on systemic need.
Right.
What do we call it when a localized group of cells decides to stop following the unified biological law? What happens when a group of cells starts aggressively optimizing only for its own unrestricted growth, building its own blood vessels to hoard nutrients, and rejoicing in what it has at the direct expense of the surrounding organs?
We call that cancer. It's angiogenesis. It builds its own supply lines to starve the rest of the body.
Precisely. Factionalism azab is civilizational cancer. When a society splits among competing power centers, it triggers the exact same cascading failure.
Imagine a society where a religious faction demands one set of laws. A powerful tribal or ethnic faction demands another set of laws based on bloodlines, and an ultra-wealthy economic elite demands a third set of laws just to protect their monopolies.
That society immediately stops moving forward.
Because all of its kinetic energy, all the potential of that boulder, is completely wasted on internal friction. You have all these brilliant human beings, all these immense natural resources, but instead of building infrastructure, instead of exploring space or curing diseases or eradicating poverty,
They spend 90% of their energy arbitrating internal disputes.
yes, they spend their time fighting legal battles, engaging in power struggles, launching propaganda campaigns, and trying to sabotage the other factions. The system just grinds to a halt.
Which brings us back to the total redefinition of Shirk. In this analytical framework, associating partners is not a theological error made by a primitive person who doesn't know any better.
Right. It is treason. It is treason or rebellion against the unified state and the design law of human equilibrium. It is a faction declaring, I will not participate in the balanced functioning of the whole. I will extract whatever resources I can from my specific group, regardless of the systemic cost.
And mathematically, a society that operates like that simply cannot compete with a society that operates with a coherent command architecture. A fractured society will always, inevitably, fall to the law of requital. It will degrade, it will be outcompeted, or it will just collapse under the weight of its own internal friction.
This raises an intensely practical problem, though.
Yeah.
Arguably the most important question of this entire deep dive.
Yeah, how do we fix it?
Exactly. If factionalism is treason against a healthy operating system, how do we actually fix it?
Yeah.
We live in a world where every single faction, every political party, every religious sect, every economic school of thought genuinely, passionately believes they're the ones with the correct track. Oh, absolutely. The capitalist says the free market is the only true law. The communist says state control is the only true law. The religious fundamentalist says their specific interpretation of ancient tradition is the only true law.
Right.
So how do we know which system is the right one when everyone is screaming that they possess the ultimate truth?
And that leads perfectly into the final synthesis of Parwaz's lecture, which deals with the critical need for an objective standard and the balance between permanence and change.
And Parvez actually shares this incredibly poignant, self-reflective, personal anecdote in the lecture to illustrate this exact epistemological problem.
Yes, his personal journey is highly illustrative of the trap of factionalism because he was born directly into it.
Right. For some historical context, the lecture mentions he was raised in a very strict, traditional household embedded in the Hanafi school of thought. For those unfamiliar, the Hanafi school is one of the major, centuries-old, traditional Sunni schools of jurisprudence.
It's deeply entrenched.
Yeah. And he talks about spending his youth in the early 20th century in the towns of Batala and Kodian in pre-partition India. Now, Batala and Kodian were essentially these massive, boiling hotbeds of intense theological debate. Rival sects would clash constantly.
Like intellectual battlegrounds.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Parvez describes how, as a young man, he was so zealous that he would literally chase down rival sectarian scholars at train stations just to engage them in fierce theological arguments. He was the ultimate factional warrior.
And it's a soldier for his local optimization. He was rejoicing in what his faction had.
Exactly. He thought he was defending the truth. But over time, through years of all these aggressive debates at train stations and in courtyards, he had this massive, shattering realization. He realized that the debates never actually ended.
No one ever won.
No one ever conceded. No one ever won. The sectarianism itself was the failure mode.
Because of the epistemological problem he finally identified. The fundamental problem with factional debates, whether it's two theologians in 1920s India or two political pundits on cable news today, is that every faction uses itself as the standard of truth.
Right. It's a closed loop.
If Faction A argues with Faction B, Faction A says, you are wrong because your ideas don't align with my books. And Faction B says, no, you are wrong because your ideas don't align with my books.
It's completely circular logic. You cannot solve factionalism from within a faction because the metrics are biased. You need an objective, external standard.
Yes.
And the lecture uses this brilliantly grounded, everyday analogy to explain this concept, the market inspector.
The Dharam Kanta. This is a perfect systems analogy for dispute resolution.
Imagine you're in a bustling, chaotic marketplace.
Yeah.
You have two merchants furiously arguing over whose weighing scale is accurate. Merchant A is selling grain, and he says his iron weight is the true, accurate 1-pound measure.
Oh.
Merchant B is buying grain, and he says, no, your weight is too light. My brass weight is the true 1-pound measure. They can scream at each other all day long. They can write books about why their weight is better.
But you cannot use Merchant A's weight to test Merchant B's scale. It's logically impossible.
Right, because the standard of measurement must be totally independent of the things being measured. It cannot have a vested interest in the outcome.
So how is the dispute resolved? The market inspector arrives, and the inspector does not care about Merchant A's feelings, and he does not care about Merchant B's traditions. He doesn't use either of their weights.
He pulls out his own weight.
Yes, he pulls out a solid, universally calibrated master weight from his pocket, an external objective standard, the Dharam Kanta. He places it on both scales. The scale that achieves perfect equilibrium with the objective standard is true. The scale that doesn't is false. End of debate.
That is such a powerful image. In Parwez's view, for human societal architecture, the Quran was meant to serve as that objective external standard, the inspector's master weight.
It was not meant to be a book of magical incantations to read over the dead. It was meant to be the unchangeable benchmark against which all human laws, tribal customs, economic theories, and political systems must be tested. If a societal rule aligns with the Din al-Qayyum, if it produces equilibrium, justice, and systemic health, it is valid. If it creates oppression, imbalance, wealth hoarding, or fractured factions, it fails the test of the master weight. It is invalid.
And here is where we synthesize the entirety of this deep dive. The permanent principle that Parwez is extracting from verses 28 to 32 is a universal, unyielding theorem. Coherent command architecture always outperforms fragmented command architecture.
Always. In tech startups, in corporate boardrooms, in national governments, and in human civilizations.
That is the permanent, unchangeable reality. It is the physics of sociology. But what does change, and what requires constant human vigilance, is the nature of the partners.
Right, the change aspect. Because today, in our modern world, the partners we associate, the competing bosses we allow to override our core design laws of justice and equilibrium, they aren't primitive statues made of clay or wood.
No, they are far more insidious because they look so sophisticated.
They're vastly more sophisticated. Today, the partners are unregulated, hyper-financialized markets that demand quarterly profit optimization, even if it means destroying the ecological balance of the planet we live on.
Wow, yeah.
The partners are extreme political ideologies that demand blind loyalty to a charismatic leader over loyalty to a constitution or objective truth. The partners are rigid identity groups and echo chambers that demand you hate your neighbors simply because they belong to a different demographic or algorithmically defined tribe.
But the structural damage to our civilization remains absolutely identical to what it was 3,000 years ago. Verses 28 through 32 aren't about ancient religious exclusivism or a deity being jealous of a stone idol. They are an organizational design theorem. They are a glaring warning about the physics of self-destruction.
It is a profound, almost jarring shift in perspective, to move from reading an ancient text as mystical theology to reading it as a rigorous, logical blueprint for systemic survival.
It demands that we stop looking at human history as a series of random, unconnected events and start looking at it as the continuous mathematical application of the law of requital. Systems that unify around an objective standard of justice survive and thrive. Systems that fracture into self-serving, locally optimizing factions inevitably degrade and fall.
Which means establishing a unified operating system isn't just about having blind faith. In fact, it is the exact opposite.
Right. It requires intense, unrelenting critical thinking. It requires a total rejection of blind tradition, the refusal to just do what your ancestors did simply because they did it. It requires actively, consciously aligning your society, your business, and your life with an objective standard of balance.
It requires acknowledging that the boulder of human ambition has incredible, world-changing potential, but without the track of an objective, unifying law, that kinetic energy will only bring ruin.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive into the sociology of the fractured order, I want to leave you, the listener, with a direct, highly personal challenge based on everything we've unpacked today. Take a step back and take a hard look at your own life.
Yeah, look at your team at work, your local community, or your own organization.
Where are you suffering from a fractured command structure? What are the modern partners, the competing priorities, the fragmented loyalties, or the contradictory metrics that are currently draining your system's kinetic energy?
Are you optimizing locally, just rejoicing in what your faction has, while the larger system you belong to is slowly degrading beneath you?
Because whether you are looking at a broken arm on an X-ray, the catastrophic failure of a tech startup, or the muddied, fragmented organizational chart of a failing human society, the diagnosis is always the same. The laws of equilibrium don't care about our excuses, our traditions, or our factions. They only demand balance. Until next time, keep analyzing the systems around you.